The first thing the Vorkai noticed about humans was the silence. Not the silence of empty space. They had catalogued enough dead worlds to find that silence comfortable, even pleasant. This was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of something watching, something patient, something that had not yet decided what to do with you. The survey vessel Contemplation of Perfect Order dropped out of Fold Transit above the third planet of a yellow star, and the crew of 47 began their standard assessment. Commander Ekaveth stood at the forward observation array, 4 of her 6 sensory stalks extended, drinking in the readings that poured through the interface membrane. The planet was blue and white and unremarkable. Oxygen, nitrogen atmosphere, liquid water, carbon-based biology. They had found 11 such worlds in the past 2 decades of the cataloging. None of them had been particularly interesting. The Vorkai were not conquerors by nature. The word itself would have confused them, since their language had no clean equivalent. They were recorders, assessors. They moved through the galaxy the way water moves through sand, not forcing anything, simply going where the path allowed, documenting what they found, incorporating whatever was useful into the vast ongoing project of Vorkai. Understanding. If a species was primitive and posed no threat, they observed it. If a species had something worth taking, a mineral, a technology, an unusual biological compound, they took it, and they did so efficiently and without particular malice. Malice, too, was a concept that didn't translate cleanly into their language. They simply did what the cataloging required. What the cataloging required of the third planet was a standard assessment. Duration approximately 40 of the planet's orbital cycles, a survey team on the surface, a documentation crew in orbit, and then a decision. The decision was almost always the same. Observe, record, leave. Return in 1,000 cycles to see what had changed. They were not prepared for what was already on the surface when their survey team landed. The probe came down in a zone the preliminary scans had flagged as low-density habitation, a stretch of territory that appeared to be in a state of ecological stress, with heavy particulate matter in the air, and large linear infrastructure cuts through the landscape. The survey team of 6 emerged from the insertion pod in the gray pre-dawn of a northern autumn morning and found themselves surrounded, not by weapons, not by soldiers, by humans who were already watching them. The humans said nothing. They simply stood at the tree line, or what passed for a tree line. The trees here were thin and unhealthy, stunted by proximity to a massive arterial roadway that carved through the landscape like a scar. And they observed the Vorkai with the same unblinking attention that the Vorkai brought to observing everything else. There were perhaps 30 of them. They wore clothing assembled from discarded materials, strips of reflective highway signage, pieces of vehicle components, fragments of processed polymers. Their faces were marked with pigments. Some carried tools fashioned from road debris, lengths of metal pipe, flattened sheets of reflective material shaped into rough weapons, handles wrapped with friction material salvaged from vehicle components. They were not attacking. They were watching. Survey lead Manath extended all 6 sensory stalks and processed the scene with the care she brought to every new encounter. The humans had biological markers consistent with the preliminary scans: bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, large cranial mass relative to body size, eyes positioned for stereoscopic forward vision. She noted the watchful quality of those eyes. She noted the absence of any visible communication between the humans, who nevertheless seemed to be operating with a coordinated awareness of the Vorkai's position and movements. "They're not afraid," said Secondary Survey Officer Tall, close at her side. "No," Manath agreed. "They're not." This, she would write later in her report, should have been treated as the first indicator. In the beginning, the people of the roadside had been afraid of everything. This was not a shameful thing. The old ones, Grandmother Petra, One-Eyed Yusuf, the woman they called the engineer who had no other name. They remembered the before time, when the community had been nothing more than a loose collection of the discarded and desperate, people who had fallen away from the great, rushing current of the world and found themselves stranded in the margin between the road and the forest. The road gave them everything and took everything. It was a river that could not be drunk from, a forest that could not be entered. It passed them in a constant roar of motion and material and possibility, and they took from it what it shed: the broken pieces, the blown-out remnants, the lost and damaged things that fell from its constant rushing body. In those early days they had been scavengers only, frightened, watchful in the way of prey animals. Then Pakam had come to them. No one remembered exactly when Pakam arrived or where he had come from. He was older than the community itself seemed to warrant, with a face that looked like a landscape, mapped with lines, scored with weather. The kind of face that had been somewhere and come back changed. He wore a coat assembled from dozens of smaller garments, layered and re-sewn until the original materials were indistinguishable. He carried a staff made from a highway signpost with a reflective diamond warning sign still attached at the top. And when he walked, he struck it against the ground in a rhythm that the others gradually found themselves matching without realizing it. Pakam had not lectured them. He had not given speeches. He had sat with them in the evening, and he had watched the road, and sometimes he made sounds, low humming, a kind of rhythmic breathing, occasionally a word or phrase repeated like an incantation. And gradually, without anyone deciding to follow him, the others had begun to do the same. They watched the road. They watched the truck drivers who moved through it. They watched the traffic enforcement officers and the road maintenance workers and the rare, ordinary travelers. They watched with an attention that became, over time, something more than watching. They began to understand the road, not the mechanics of it, not the engineering. They understood it the way a river-dwelling people might understand a river, not as a built thing but as a living thing, something with moods and patterns and a personality that could be read and, eventually, engaged with. And once you could engage with something, Pakam taught them, you were no longer its victim. "The road does not know us," he said once, in the firelit quiet of late night, his voice low enough that the community had to lean in to hear it. "This is good. What does not know us cannot prepare for us. What does not know us cannot defend against us." He reached into the fire with a bare hand and drew out a coal, holding it in his palm and breathing on it until it glowed cherry red. No one asked how he did not burn. They understood by then that Pakam's relationship with pain was not the same as theirs. "We learn from the road," he continued. "We become the road. We become the trucks and the men who drive them and the men who watch them. We put on their faces. And when we wear their faces, we take their power into ourselves." He dropped the coal back into the fire. "This is how the weak survive against the strong. You do not fight the thing that is stronger than you. You become it, until you understand it better than it understands itself." He was talking about the road. At the time, he was only talking about the road. The Vorkai survey team made camp 300 meters from the human settlement and began their documentation work with the efficient thoroughness for which the cataloging was known. Menoth had seen the initial data from the orbital survey and had already developed a preliminary assessment. This community was an outlier, a marginal group existing in suboptimal conditions on the edge of what appeared to be a significantly more developed civilization. They were interesting primarily as an example of human adaptive behavior under resource scarcity. Not a technological civilization. Their tools were rudimentary, their shelter improvised, their food sources opportunistic, but surviving. Stubbornly, inexplicably surviving in a zone that the Vorkai ecological models suggested should have driven them out or killed them long ago. What Menoth could not account for, and what nagged at her with a persistence she chose, initially, to treat as methodological overcaution, was the observation protocols. The humans were watching the survey team with the same attention the survey team was bringing to them. More than watching, they were studying. She could see it in the way the human elders positioned themselves, always at angles that gave clear sightlines to multiple members of the Vorkai team simultaneously, always in pairs or small groups, always maintaining a loose spacing that would have been hard to describe as tactical without evidence of actual tactical intent, but which, if she were being honest with herself, looked very much like a perimeter. On the third day, one of the human males, young, perhaps 20 standard years, his clothing assembled from orange safety materials and his face marked with the pigmented insignia of the community's hierarchy, walked to within 30 meters of the survey team's camp and stopped. He stood there for perhaps 2 hours. He did not speak. He did not perform any observable action. He simply watched. Secondary Survey Officer Tall found this deeply unsettling. Menoth found it interesting. "He's cataloging us," she said. "Sir, he's doing what we're doing. He's recording us, filing us." Tall processed this. "He doesn't have any recording equipment." "He has a brain," Menoth said, "based on the cranial measurements from the orbital scans. A quite substantial one." The rituals had begun as imitation and become something else. This was the part that the community's 2 resident scholars, a former academic named Volkov, and a woman who had been some kind of cultural analyst, before the road claimed her, known now simply as the commentator, argued about endlessly in the evenings. Volkov believed that the rituals were a form of sympathetic magic, an attempt to influence the road by enacting its processes. The commentator believed that the rituals were something more sophisticated, a technology of knowledge transfer, a way of encoding understanding in the body and the nervous system rather than in language or text. "You're both right," Pakam told them once, when they brought their argument to him as they occasionally did, hoping for resolution. "And you're both explaining the wrong thing." He was seated on an upturned traffic cone, smoking something from a pipe assembled from salvaged vehicle parts, his staff leaning against the patchwork wall beside him. The firelight made the reflective elements in his coat flash and shift. "The ritual is not about the road," he said. "The ritual is about what happens to us when we perform it, what it teaches us, what it puts into our hands." He picked up his staff and turned the reflective sign at its top toward the firelight. His own face looked back at him, distorted in the curved surface. When Marta dresses as the truck driver and walks the road, she is not trying to make the trucks run better. She is learning how a truck driver sees. She is putting that sight into her body so that when a truck comes, she knows, not thinks, knows where it will go and what it will do. She becomes capable of prediction that looks like magic but is only observation, very deep observation, stored where it cannot be forgotten. He handed the staff to Volkov, who looked at his own distorted reflection and looked away. "The road is a system," Pakam said. "Every system can be learned. Every system can be worn. And once you can wear a system, you are no longer outside it, at its mercy. You are inside it. You have power." The commentator wrote this down in a notebook assembled from highway maps and packaging materials, using a pen she had found in the road debris 3 years prior. She did not know that she was recording a doctrine that would, within 2 decades, save the human species from extinction. The assessment review meeting on day 30 of the survey was, by Vorkai standards, routine. Manath presented her findings to the full survey team. The human community was approximately 200 individuals, concentrated in the marginal zone along the roadside. They were primarily hunter-gatherers, supplemented by what the Vorkai taxonomically classified as scavenging behavior, though Manath noted that the community had developed highly refined techniques for predicting, locating, and accessing roadshed materials that were difficult to attribute to random scavenging. Their social structure was hierarchical, but not rigidly so, with authority concentrated in figures of demonstrated skill. She used demonstrated skill deliberately, having observed that age, physical dominance, and gender were poor predictors of status in this community. Practical competence, specifically the demonstrated ability to read and work with the road system, appeared to be the primary determinant. Their ritual practices were complex and central to community functioning. Manath catalogued what she had observed, the practice of what she termed archetype performance, in which community members ritually enacted the behaviors of road workers, drivers, and other associated figures in what appeared to be a meditative or trance state. The community's use of psychoactive plant preparations to facilitate this state. The role of the elder figure they called Pakam as conductor and interpreter of these rituals, and the elaborate material culture that had developed around them, consisting of assemblages of road debris that appeared to have both practical and symbolic functions. She noted the community's unusual capacity for sustained, focused observation. She noted the absence of fear responses in their interaction with the survey team. She noted, with the careful neutrality required of all cataloging assessments, that the community had, in the 30 days since the survey team's arrival, demonstrated a rate of behavioral adaptation to the survey team's presence that was, by Vorkai standards, exceptional. "What does exceptional mean in specific terms?" asked the mission's senior analyst, Coordinator Seveth, who was participating in the review from the orbital station via communication array. "They have begun wearing elements of our equipment," Manath said. "Fragments of the insertion pod's ablative shielding that broke off on landing. Pieces of the survey team's secondary communication relay that failed and was left at the site. They've incorporated these materials into their clothing and their ritualistic assemblages with the same facility they apply to road debris." Seveth processed this. "That's consistent with their documented material culture, taking useful debris. Nothing unusual." "The timing is what I find notable," Manath said. "They incorporated our materials into their ritual structures within 6 days of our arrival. The rituals they then performed using those materials involved enactments of Vorkai behavior that were," she paused, which was unusual for her, Accurate, coordinator, specifically accurate in ways that required sustained high-quality observation. Brief silence on the communication array. How accurate? Seveth asked. One of the younger community members performed a 12-minute enactment of Vorkai's sensory stalk movement patterns. That was close enough to our standard survey protocols that 2 members of my team initially thought it was a communication attempt. Seveth was quiet for longer this time. Menoth, he said finally, do you have a recommendation? I have an observation, she said. Whether it constitutes a recommendation depends on how you interpret it. Go ahead. These humans are not watching us the way an observed species watches an observer. They're watching us the way we watch them. She let that settle. They're conducting a survey. Pacom gathered the community in the open ground between the shelters and the road. This was not unusual. He gathered them regularly for rituals, for planning discussions, for the communal meals that he had made a cornerstone of community practice from the beginning. What was unusual was the time of day. Mid-morning, when the road was at its most active and the noise made sustained speech difficult, when the light was hard and unforgiving and everyone should have been at their appointed tasks. He stood in the center of the gathering ground with his staff planted before him and looked at all of them in turn. Not quickly, not performatively, but with the patient, comprehensive attention he brought to everything. He was very old by now. No one could say how old. He looked, the commentator once wrote, like a man who had decided not to die yet but had not entirely ruled it out. The newcomers, he said, no preamble, no context. As if they had all been thinking about nothing else, which most of them had. Tell me what you've learned, they told him. The young ones went first because they were the closest observers. They'd been assigned to the rotation, sitting at the tree line in 2-hour shifts, watching the survey camp. Marta spoke about the newcomers' equipment, the devices they carried, the way they used them, the peculiarities of their sensory organs. Dmitri spoke about their communication patterns, the subsonic frequencies they used that he had begun to feel in his teeth before he consciously registered hearing them. Young Azel, 16 years old, the daughter of 2 community veterans, spoke about their emotional states as she read them from posture and movement. The one in the front who was curious, the 2 behind who were nervous, the one on the far left who was something she didn't have a word for but which she could imitate, and she did, standing up and letting her shoulders settle in a very particular way, her head tilting to a very particular angle, and everyone who had been watching the survey camp felt a cold recognition run through them. Pacom listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a long time. The road roared past them, trucks, cars, the steady thunder of the world they lived alongside but not inside. They came to record us, he said finally. To observe and to leave. That is what they do, you understand this. Nods around the circle. They did not expect us to record them back. A small pause. We have surprised them. This is useful. Surprise is a form of power. He looked at the commentator, who was scribbling in her notebook. Write this down, he said, which was unnecessary since she always did, but he liked to say it. The observer believes themselves invisible. This is their weakness. We were once like that too. Every organism begins as prey. The ones who survive long enough to be studied by something like this. He gestured in the direction of the survey camp, are the ones who learn to look back. He sat down cross-legged on the ground, which was a signal that the formal part of the gathering was over and the working part was beginning. I want to learn to be them, he said. What they are, not just what they do. The way they see, the way they move through the world. We will begin tonight. The second phase of the survey began with a series of what Menoth classified as contact events, moments when individual humans approached the survey camp in ways that did not fit standard predator awareness or territorial challenge behavioral models. They didn't come with weapons. They didn't come in groups that suggested aggression. They came alone or in pairs, and they brought things. The first offering was a construction of road debris assembled with a craftsmanship that Menoth had not anticipated. Fragments of reflective material arranged to capture and redirect light in a way that, she gradually realized, was a representation of the Vorkai's bioluminescent communication patterns. It was rough, the materials were wrong, the proportions were approximate, but the intention was unmistakable. Some human had watched the survey team communicate using their natural bioluminescence, had decoded at least the basic structural parameters of that communication, and had built a physical model of it. Tal was alarmed. Menoth was fascinated. The second offering was more disturbing. A woven object incorporating fragments of the failed communication relay that the survey team had abandoned, arranged around what appeared to be a hand-drawn schematic of the relay's internal components. The schematic was not exact, but it was close enough to suggest that the human who made it had a better than intuitive understanding of Vorkai engineering principles. "They're reverse engineering our equipment," Tall said, "from a broken relay." "They're modeling it," Manath corrected, "trying to understand how it works, which is not the same as being able to replicate it. It's close enough to the same thing to concern me." Manath looked at the schematic for a long time. "Do you know what this reminds me of?" she said. "The cargo practices of pre-technological species. On worlds where the population has encountered advanced technology without context for it, they sometimes develop practices of imitative ritual, building representations of the technology as a way of accessing what they perceive as its power. It's a well-documented adaptive response. You think that's what this is? I think the humans are doing something more sophisticated than standard cargo practice," Manath said. "I think they understand, at some functional level, that imitation is not the same as acquisition. They're not building this because they think it will work. They're building it because the building teaches them something." She set the schematic down carefully. "The question," she said, "is what it's teaching them." The ritual for the newcomers was prepared over the course of a week. Packham directed it with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He worked with Marta on the physical vocabulary, the way the survey team held their bodies, the movement of their sensory organs, the particular quality of their attention that was different from human attention, in ways that Marta had to work to articulate, but could demonstrate with an accuracy that made people uneasy to watch. He worked with Dmitri on the sound component, not just the subsonic communication frequencies, which Dmitri could reproduce roughly in his chest and throat, but the ambient sound that the survey camp produced, the soft machinery hum, the subtle electromagnetic signatures that the community's most sensitive members had begun to register as a kind of pressure at the back of the skull. He worked with Aisel on the emotional content, which he considered the most important element. "What you were showing us," he said to her, sitting with her in the early morning before the rest of the community was up. "That posture, that particular tilt of the head. What does it mean?" Aisel thought about it. She was a careful thinker. She had her mother's precision and her father's patience. And she had been raised in the community's tradition of close observation, which meant she had spent more of her life watching and thinking about what she watched than almost anything else. "It's like when you're doing math," she said finally. "When you have numbers in your head, and you're working them forward and backward at the same time. There's a feeling the world gets smaller. You can only see the problem. But you're not scared. She searched for the word. Occupied. Completely occupied." Packham nodded slowly. "And the one you call the nervous one? That's different. The nervous one knows something is wrong, but doesn't know what. Like when you hear a sound from the road at night, and you don't know if it's dangerous. All your attention goes forward, but you haven't decided what to do yet." "And the leader?" Aisel was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the road, which was just beginning to wake in the gray morning light, the first trucks rolling through before the commuter traffic built. "The leader is watching us the way Packham watches the road," she said. "Like she thinks she can understand us if she looks long enough. Like she thinks understanding us will tell her what to do." Packham sat with this for a while. "She's right," he said, "and so are we." The orbital station received Manath's updated assessment report on day 62 of the survey, and Coordinator Seveth read it 3 times, before transmitting it up the chain to the Regional Assessment Authority. The report documented what Manath had taken to calling the mimicry acceleration, the rate at which the human community had incorporated and reproduced Vorkai behavioral and material signatures had increased by a factor of approximately 4 over the previous 30 days. They were no longer just watching. They were practicing. Manath had, on multiple occasions, observed small groups of humans performing sustained enactments of Vorkai survey behaviors, the sensory array deployment, the sample collection protocols, even the specific motion patterns of equipment calibration, with a degree of accuracy that had moved from unsettling into something Manath's report classified with careful neutrality as operationally significant. She had not yet used the word threat, but the word was present in the structure of her sentences like a stone under water. Seveth sent back a single question. "What is their technological level?" Manath's reply, "Lower than their cognitive level would suggest. Their material culture is limited by resource access rather than intelligence." Given resource access, projection models indicate rapid advancement. Seventh's follow-up, do you assess them as a current threat? Menoth took a full day to compose her answer. When it came, it said, not yet. But I want to flag a different question. The question is not whether they are currently capable of harming us. The question is whether they are currently capable of understanding us. The Regional Assessment Authority reviewed the exchange and issued a standard Accelerated Assessment Protocol order. Conclude survey, make extraction decision, and report within 30 days. Menoth sat in her command station and looked at the planet below her, blue and white and unremarkable, and felt, for the first time in many years of the cataloging, genuinely uncertain about what she was looking at. The night of the major ritual was cloudless and cold, with a full moon that turned the roadside world silver and sharp-edged. They began at midnight. Pacom had prepared the community with a week of groundwork. The specific plant preparations that loosened the rigid categories of waking thought, the breathing exercises that made the body porous to outside influence, the sustained fasting that made the mind clear and hungry and receptive. These were not new techniques. They had been the community's ritual toolkit for years. What was new was the purpose to which they were being applied. The entire community participated. Even the scholars, even the commentator who had always observed rituals from the edge rather than entering them, even the youngest children, who took smaller doses of the preparations and sat in the outer ring where Pacom could keep an eye on them. What Azel saw in the open state of the ritual was not what she expected. She had expected to see the survey team, the specific individuals she had spent weeks observing, whose movements and expressions she had memorized. She had expected to become those specific individuals, to wear their patterns the way she wore a coat. What happened instead was that she saw through them. She saw the structure behind the behavior. She saw the Vorkai not as a collection of specific individuals, but as a system. The shape of their thinking, the architecture of their attention, the particular way they processed information and moved toward decision. She saw what they wanted, not in language, not in declared intention, but in the grain of how they operated, the direction in which all their actions leaned. They wanted to know. This was not unusual. So did the community. They wanted to know so that they could decide. This too was familiar. What was unfamiliar, what filled Azel with a feeling she could not entirely classify as either comfort or fear, was the simplicity of the decision they were moving toward. The Vorkai were not complicated beings. They had a protocol. They had a procedure. The procedure had options, and they were moving through the options in order, checking boxes, following a pathway that had been established long before they arrived here, and would continue long after they left. They were not malicious. They were not kind. They were a system doing what systems do, processing inputs, following pathways, producing outputs. And the output they were moving toward, she could feel it with a horrible clarity, was removal. Not death, necessarily, not violence necessarily, but removal. The human community in the Vorkai assessment was an anomalous data point in a sector that was otherwise unremarkable. The anomaly could be left in place, monitored from a distance, or it could be resolved. The resolution options ranged from the relatively benign displacement to a more easily monitored zone to the simple expedient. Azel came out of the ritual shaking and sat by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders while Pacom made her drink something hot and watched her with his road-mapped face. What did you see? He asked. She told him. He was quiet for a long time. Good, he said finally. Now we know what we're working with. Menoth received permission for a direct contact attempt on day 70. The Vorkai had protocols for this. First contact with sentient species was governed by a substantial body of procedure developed over centuries of the cataloging, refined through thousands of encounters. The protocols were good. Menoth trusted them. She walked to the edge of the tree line alone, as the protocols required for initial contact with non-aggressive primitive species, and she activated the translation substrate, a technological layer that would work to build a working model of the human language over the course of the contact session. The human elder was waiting for her. Pacom stood at the tree line with his staff planted before him and his coat of layered garments shifting in the morning breeze, and his lined face carrying an expression that the translation substrate was not yet equipped to parse, but that Menoth's own long-trained observational instincts read as something between welcome and appraisal. He had brought 3 others, Marta, Dmitri, and Azel. Menoth had brought her own team of 3 as the protocols required. They stood 10 meters apart and looked at each other. Then Pakhom did something that was not in Menoth's protocols or her training or her long experience. He performed a greeting in Vorkai. Not a spoken greeting. The Vorkai language was not primarily sonic, and humans lacked the bioluminescent organs to replicate its primary channel. But the physical component of a Vorkai formal greeting, the specific position of the body, the inclination of the upper torso, the positioning of the limbs. It was a little off, the proportions were wrong, human anatomy being different from Vorkai anatomy, but the structure was exactly right. The meaning was exactly right. It said, "I acknowledge you as a thinking being. I am prepared for communication." Menoth's 3 team members made various sounds of alarm and confusion. Menoth herself stood very still and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Genuine surprise. She returned the greeting. The first real conversations were slow and strange, and neither side found them fully satisfying, which both sides found encouraging in its way. Menoth's translation substrate built the model of human language over the course of 6 sessions spanning 3 weeks, and Azel, who turned out to be the community's best linguistic mimic, built her own working model of the substrate's output through a combination of native intelligence and what Menoth eventually realized was the same deep observational training she had applied to everything else. In those first weeks, Menoth asked the questions she was supposed to ask: community structure, resource base, relationship to the larger civilization nearby. Pakhom answered some of them and declined to answer others, which itself told her things. She noted that he was also asking questions, more indirectly, more patiently, but asking, and that his questions had a pattern she didn't immediately identify, but which nagged at her until the evening of the 4th session when she was reviewing her notes and realized that every question Pakhom had asked her was a question about Vorkai decision-making processes, not capabilities, not technology, decisions. He wanted to know how the Vorkai made choices. She reported this to Seveth. Seveth told her it was probably standard intelligence gathering by a species encountering an unknown actor. She agreed that this was a reasonable interpretation. She didn't find it fully satisfying. On the morning of the 5th session, she arrived at the tree line to find Azel waiting alone. "Pakhom is resting," Azel said, in what was by now a reasonably functional approximation of the translation substrate's output. "He said I should talk to you today." "What would you like to talk about?" Menoth asked. Azel looked at her with those brown human eyes, so different from Vorkai sensory organs, fixed and forward-facing, limited in spectrum but apparently compensated for by an unusual degree of processing sophistication, and said, with a directness that the community had evidently decided was the right approach, "I want to know what happens to us. In your assessment, what you decide." Menoth was silent for a moment. "We haven't decided," she said. "You're going to decide soon," Azel said. "I know the shape of how you make decisions. I've been learning it." She paused. "The decision has 3 options. We've been trying to figure out what determines which one you choose." The coldness that went through Menoth then was not fear exactly. It was the particular chill of being understood. "Who taught you that?" she said. "Pakhom," Azel said. "But I did most of the learning myself. It's what we do. We watch things until we understand them. Then She made a gesture with her hands that Menoth's substrate didn't catch, but that looked, in the morning light, like something being absorbed. The night before the assessment review, Pakhom gathered the community for the second major ritual. He was very tired. The community could see it. The lines of his face had deepened, and he moved with a careful economy that was different from his usual deliberate grace. He had been spending long hours in conversation with Menoth, sessions that extended past the formal contact protocols into something more like 2 old professionals talking shop, and those sessions were taking something out of him. He didn't complain about this. He never complained about the cost of the work. But the community watched him the way the community always watched the things that mattered to it, with complete attention. "Tomorrow they decide," he said. The fire crackled. The road roared past them. It never stopped, the road. This was one of the things the community had internalized so deeply, that the silence of the road would have been more alarming than its noise. "Whatever they decide," he said, "we will not be what they expect." He reached into his coat and produced a small object, a fragment of the Vorkai survey team's ablative shielding, about the size of his palm, worked into a shape that was not quite a tool and not quite an art object. The community had produced dozens of these over the past weeks. They were not attempts to replicate Vorkai technology. They were something more like portraits or maps, ways of holding understanding in material form. The road taught us something important, Pakam said. The road is stronger than we are. It is faster. It has more material wealth, more power, more reach. We cannot fight the road. He held the fragment up so the firelight caught it, making the metallic surface flash. But the road has never, in all the years we've lived beside it, once considered us a threat. Silence around the fire. This, he said, is the road's mistake. He passed the fragment to Marta, who passed it to Dmitri, who passed it to Aesel, who held it for a long time before passing it on. It moves around the circle, each person holding it for a moment, some closing their eyes, some keeping them open and fixed on the firelight. They came to study us, Pakama said. They did not come prepared to be studied. They did not come prepared to be worn. They did not come prepared to be understood from the inside. He watched the fragment make its circuit. We have been preparing for something like this our whole lives. We just didn't know it yet. The fragment came back to him. He closed his fingers around it. Whatever they decide tomorrow, he said, we will not be surprised. And they will be. The assessment review convened with Menoth presenting to the full regional assessment authority rather than just to Seveth, which told her something about how seriously her reports had been taken. She presented her findings systematically. Community structure, population, technological level, resource base, relationship to the larger civilization, which she now knew, from weeks of conversation with Pakam, was significant and complicated. The community existed in conscious distinction from the larger civilization, not in ignorance of it. They had chosen this margin. This was not poverty or failure. This was a deliberate position. She presented the mimicry data, the rate of behavioral incorporation, the accuracy of the reproductions, the sophistication of the framework building she had observed in her direct contact sessions with community members. She presented Aesel's question. The Regional Assessment Authority was quiet when she finished. Your recommendation? Said the authority chair. Observe, Menoth said. Return in 50 cycles. The mimicry data suggests a potential security concern. The mimicry data suggests a species that is exceptionally good at learning from observation, Menoth said. That is not a security concern. That is a marker. A marker of what? Menoth thought of Pakam standing at the tree line with his patched coat and his road sign staff and his face like a mapped landscape. She thought of Aesel asking her question with that directness that assumed complete understanding on both sides. She thought of the ritual assemblages, the careful reproductions, the community that had built its entire culture around the practice of understanding the things it lived alongside by becoming them. A marker, she said carefully, of a species that has been preparing for exactly this for a long time, without knowing it was preparing for this specifically. You're suggesting they're not a threat. I'm suggesting something more interesting than that. She paused. I'm suggesting that the standard threat assessment framework may not be the right tool for this species. A species that responds to superior power by learning to model it, to understand it from the inside, to wear it until they can predict it. That's not a species that poses a conventional threat. It's a species that poses a different kind of challenge. Another long silence from the authority. What kind of challenge? The chair asked. The kind, Menoth said, that you cannot prepare for by being more powerful. Because it doesn't care how powerful you are. It only cares how well it can understand you. She let this sit for a moment. And they understand us, she added quietly. Quite well by now. The decision came 3 days later. Menoth carried it to the tree line herself with Tal at her side and the full contact protocol team behind her. She found Pakam and Aesel waiting, as if they had known she was coming, which they probably had, since the community's observation network had been tracking every movement around the survey camp since day one. She told them the decision. Observe, no displacement, no intervention, return in 50 cycles. Pakam listened to the translation without any visible reaction. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough that Menoth began to wonder what he was thinking. Then he looked at her with his road-mapped face and said, through Aesel's translation, we expected something else. I know, Menoth said. We surprised you. A brief pause. Then something moved across Pakam's face that the translation substrate couldn't parse, but that Menoth's own long, trained instincts read as something very close to satisfaction. Yes, he said, you did. Aesel was watching Menoth with those fixed, forward-facing eyes. You changed the recommendation, she said. It wasn't a question. I presented what I observed, Menoth said carefully. You argued for us, Aesel said. Still not a question. Menoth thought about how to answer this. In the Vorkai framework, an assessor presented findings and the authority made decisions. She had presented findings. The decision that resulted was the authorities. This was correct and proper. But she had also spent 3 weeks in conversation with a very old human who had an extraordinary capacity for asking questions that made you see what you were actually doing rather than what you thought you were doing. And those conversations had changed something, loosened something. The thing they had loosened, she suspected, was the part of her that had stopped asking why the protocols were the protocols. I presented what I observed, she said again. Acel studied her for a moment longer, then she nodded once, with a decisiveness that looked very like Pacom's when he had concluded something was true. All right, she said. They left on the 22nd day of the local autumn. Menoth stood at the forward observation array as the contemplation of perfect order cleared the atmosphere and the planet receded below her, blue and white, unremarkable, a thin band of green and brown where the continental landmasses met the oceans. She could see at the resolution available to the array the line of the great orbital road they called the MCOD, a perfect ring, a human-built circuit around a human-built city, catching the morning light. Somewhere along that ring, too small to see from here, a community existed in a margin. They had fire and salvage tools, and a complicated ritual culture built around the practice of becoming the things they needed to understand. They had a very old man who had figured out, long before anyone came to test his understanding, that the only way to survive against something stronger than you was to learn it better than it knew itself. Tal came to stand beside her. "Do you think they'll be all right?" he asked. 50 cycles is a long time for a community that size. Menoth thought about this. She thought about Acel's question, the directness of it, the assumption it carried, the very specific intelligence required to arrive at that assumption from the information available. She thought about the ritual assemblage she had been shown on her 7th contact session, a construction of salvaged materials, road debris and Vorkai equipment fragments and woven plant material that mapped the relationship between the community and the road and, implicitly, between the community and the survey team. It was a model. It was not a simple model. She thought about Pacom saying through Acel's translation, "We were expecting something else." "They'll be all right," she said. "They've been practicing for this their whole lives." She watched the planet dwindle against the stars. "The question," she said quietly, more to herself than to Tal, "is whether we'll be all right in 50 cycles." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that they are very good at learning to model the things they live alongside. And they've had 50 cycles to work on us." She watched the blue-white sphere until it was just another point of light. "I'll be very curious what they know about us by then, and what they've done with the knowing." The 50 cycles passed. The world changed during those 50 cycles. Not just the marginal community, the whole world. The great currents of the larger civilization shifted and eddied in ways that no individual or organization controlled in the way of large civilizations generally. Technologies developed, connections strengthened. The long-standing barriers between the marginal communities and the mainstream civilization eroded in some places and calcified in others. The community of the roadside did not stay the same. Acel grew up. She studied everything she could get access to, not just the road and its logic, not just the human world that lay beyond the community's margins, but the wider context she had glimpsed in the ritual 3 years prior, and spent the subsequent years trying to understand without the aid of another Vorkai survey team to observe directly. She built models. She was very good at building models. Paham had taught her that everything was a system, and every system could be learned and worn, and she applied this to astrophysics and xenobiology, and the fragmentary records she had assembled from every description she could find of Vorkai, behavior and decision-making. She taught what she learned to others, and they taught what they learned to others, and the thing that Pakhom had built in the margin of the road extended itself out into the larger world, with the patient thoroughness of something that had been growing underground for a long time and was only now beginning to break surface. Pakhom died in the 32nd cycle, in late autumn, beside the road. He died the way he had lived, watching. The commentator was with him. She recorded his last words, which were, "The road is still there." "Good." Acel spoke at the gathering after his death and said what the whole community knew, that Pakhom had built something that would outlast him by orders of magnitude, which was the only kind of immortality that actually worked. She said that he had taught them the most important thing anyone had ever taught them, which was that you are never only what you are. You are also everything you have learned to become. and that the capacity to learn to become things, to put on other minds, the way you put on other clothes, to understand from the inside what looks impossible to touch from the outside, was the deepest human power there was. She said this to the community, but she was also, she knew, saying it to the empty sky. The contemplation of perfect order dropped out of fold transit above the third planet of the yellow star in the 31st year of the local autumn, and immediately every alert system on the survey vessel activated simultaneously. They were not alone in the system. 47 human-built vessels occupied the outer orbits, distributed in a pattern that the Vorkai tactical analysis systems processed, and then processed again because the results kept coming back the same. It was a surveillance array, a perfect surveillance array, covering every viable approach vector to the planet, with a sophistication that the analysis systems rated as approximately 2 development generations beyond what the preliminary survey data had projected for human technological capability at this point. Menoth stood at the forward array and felt the familiar cold clarity that she associated with moments when the world was about to require something of her that she had not prepared for. Her communication array activated. A voice came through it, clean without static in Vorkai, with an accent that was specifically her own regional accent. "Commander Menoth," the voice said, "welcome back. We've been waiting." She recognized the voice before the translation substrate finished parsing it. She had heard it as a young woman's voice, tentative and precise. It had matured over 50 cycles into something that carried the same quality, careful, direct, utterly without pretense, in a deeper register. "Aesel," she said. "Yes," Aesel said. "You taught me a great deal 50 cycles ago. Indirectly. I hope you don't mind. What have you done?" Menoth said. And she was genuinely asking. "What we do," Aesel said. "We watched, we learned, we built models." A brief pause. "You should know that the models are very good by now. We know your assessment protocols. We know your decision trees. We know the parameters of the options your authority will be evaluating when they receive your new report." Another pause. "We know what makes the difference between the options." Menoth's hand hovered over the communication controls. "And what makes the difference?" "Whether you believe we're manageable," Aesel said. "Whether you believe that your assessment of us in 50 cycles will be the same kind of assessment you made 50 cycles ago, a procedure applied to a subject, or whether you understand that it's something else now." "What is it now?" "A negotiation," Aesel said, "between two parties who understand each other quite well." The 47 human vessels maintained their positions in the outer orbits. They had not activated weapons systems. The tactical analysis confirmed this. They were not a threat in the conventional sense. They were a presence, a demonstration, a message. Menoth thought of Pakam at the tree line with his roadside staff, the first day of the survey. She thought of the community watching from the shadows. She thought of Aesel asking her question. "I want to know what happens to us in your assessment." "What do you want?" she asked. "What we've always wanted," Aesel said. "To continue, to be known and not managed, to be left to grow in the margin we chose, and to be met as equals when we're ready." A pause, and we're ready. Menoth looked at the planet below her, blue and white. The line of the road still visible in the morning light, though the city it circled had grown considerably in 50 cycles. The margin they had built their lives in, watching and learning and becoming. "I'll need to present this to the authority," she said. "Of course," Aesel said. "We've prepared materials that may assist with your presentation." Menoth felt something she eventually identified as the Vorkai equivalent of laughter. Not humor exactly, but the particular sensation of a system encountering something it had not predicted and finding, against all expectation, that it was pleased. "What kind of materials?" she said. "A complete model of your assessment decision tree," Aesel said, "with annotations, our analysis of the parameters that determine each option, and a recommendation for which option is in the long-term interests of both parties." A brief pause, and she thought she heard something in Aesel's voice that was the human equivalent of the same sensation. "Please surprise meeting. Please surprise across 50 cycles and the width of an orbit." "We've been watching," Aesel said. "We've been learning. This is what we do." Menoth stood at the forward array and looked at the planet that had surprised her once before, and was now offering to surprise her again. And she thought about protocols and procedures and the way systems met other systems, and she thought about an old man in a patched coat striking a roadside staff against the ground, and she thought about what it meant to build an entire culture around the practice of understanding things from the inside. She opened the communication array. "Send me the materials," she said. I want to read them before I call the authority. Below her, blue and white and patient and more than ready, the world waited. The road still ran. The community still watched. And somewhere in the archive of a vessel approaching from the outer orbits, 50 cycles of careful observation prepared to speak. They were not what the Vorkai had come prepared to find. They were never, in all the history of the cataloging, what anyone came prepared to find. But then, they never had been. It was perhaps the most human thing about them, the gift for being impossible to predict, the genius for turning the act of watching into something that changed the watcher, the stubborn refusal to remain a specimen when the opportunity to become a colleague presented itself. Manath read the first page of the assessment model Asil sent her and stopped. Read it again. Then a third time. It was better than her own. She sat with that for a moment. The strangeness of it, the particular flavor of being understood, and then she pulled up the communication array and began to compose her report to the Regional Assessment Authority. It would be, she suspected, the most interesting report she had ever written, and the recommendation would be the same as last time, but for completely different reasons.